Hello, booktube. Welcome back to Please Read Your Book. My name's Carl, and in this video I'm going to talk about two of my favorite horror manga. So the first one is Tomie by Junji Ito. Quite well known, quite famous, maybe not a shocker there, but I've enjoyed it quite a bit and I'm going to talk about it. And the second one is maybe lesser known. I'm not sure. It was lesser known to me until recently. And that is Happiness by Shuzo Oshimi. And I have to apologize, I had to look at the name there to get that correct. So, first one, Tomie by Junji Ito. This is a very strange horror manga. And it was the first, not the first, but I think the first big horror, like serious horror manga that I read. I'd read some shorts before, definitely some shorts by Junji Ito, and some other like adaptations of like H.P. Lovecraft stories. But this was the first like original horror manga that I've ever read, and wow, it's very weird. I think I'm kind of new to manga, and if you're new to manga too, manga itself can sometimes be a bit strange. I think there are some conventions to the storytelling style that, if you're not familiar with it or used to it, are just a little bit weird. Tomie doesn't have the sort of like absurd humor that I'm thinking of when I think about that stuff, but it does have some kind of strange abstractions, and there are some times where the narrative just kind of jumps forward a bit, and I find that to kind of be happening in manga in general. I don't really know what to think of that. I'm not an expert on manga, but what I will tell you is that it works quite well in Tomie as a way to keep kind of propelling the narrative forward. This is a really chilling and really thought-provoking manga, and I want to talk more about why I think it's thought-provoking. There's a lot of videos that discuss this manga and detail the plot and the artwork and some of like Junji Ito's processes and things like that. But one thing along with it that I do want to note is that this was a very early book or series for Junji Ito, and the book that you can typically come across now, and is the one that I have, I mean I have the digital version, but you can certainly buy the physical version of it as well, is a compilation of all the Tomie stories. And so this was a series that came out over a number of years, and there are gaps in time between publications of the volumes when Ito was working on something else, or there's just a natural passage of time. So one thing that makes that interesting or important is you can see Junji Ito's style evolving across these volumes, within this collected volume, but across the volumes in the collection. You can see his narrative style developing. You can see the themes that come up in his work developing, along with even just with his art style develops too. I mean, there's a huge difference between that very first story where we learn about Tomie all the way through to the end. If you look at the final chapters, you can see a very huge development, very, very big development. So that is kind of an interesting thing, I think. But let's talk a little bit about the plot, and then I'm going to talk about what I think makes this a really interesting and really compelling manga. So this book revolves around the character of Tomie. And Tomie is a girl who is not really a girl. And it paints a very bleak and almost nihilistic kind of portrait of human nature, really. I think if I was going to sum it up, that's really what this is all about, is human nature, but there's kind of something that we'll get to about that is a little bleak, a little dark, a little surprising, but also quite true. So as we said, Tomie is a girl, and in the first chapter, she seems to maybe be a high school student. Maybe she's 16, 17, 18, something like that. And she is killed very gruesomely. She is inexplicably, we're not sure why, but she's basically slaughtered by a teacher and her classmates, and she's dismembered. And that's when we learn that she's not ordinary, because when she becomes dismembered, she regenerates. Her body is able to regrow, sometimes quite quickly, sometimes on the spot. Sometimes it takes a long time, depending on, it seems to be depending on kind of situation or the extent to which it happened. But she's got this ability to regenerate from injury, and that becomes a recurring theme within the manga of basically a body horror. And this is also kind of a trademark in Junji Ito's artwork as well. A lot of the monsters and creatures and demons and things that he draws have some sort of horrifying physical thing about them, something that is just very wrong, something that shouldn't be, but yet somehow is. And Tomie is when she is in her normal form, when she's a human girl or a woman, she's quite attractive. She's not the prototypical or stereotypical manga beauty. I mean, she's not voluptuous and, like what we typically think of with female Japanese characters in comics and manga. But she's very beautiful and she's very alluring. And she has this ability to attract people, typically men, but it can also be women around her, and kind of charm them. A lot of people say that she seduces them, but it's not overtly seduction. It's more subtle and manipulative, and she's very charming. But the end game is that she will drive people mad, like literally. She will drive them to the point of committing murder and violence and all sorts of extreme acts that they normally wouldn't do. And it's somehow she's able to just make all these things happen. But we don't really know how or why. And she doesn't either. And there is kind of in the first half of the manga, she's not really comfortable with what she does, with what her powers are. And she's kind of trying to figure it out, and there's a few instances, a few chapters where she kind of doesn't want it to happen, and yet it does. But then there's just a point, there's some sort of tipping point where she just kind of gives up. She stops trying to not have these things happen, and she just lets them happen. And that's what I wanted to say about human nature, is that Tomie accepts her nature, her true nature. Her true nature is to just be this sort of chaotic spirit that will induce violence and murder and mayhem. And I think that's one of the more horrifying aspects of this manga, is a character, or whether it's human or not, kind of just accepting that it's evil, and that it's going to do bad things, and that bad things are going to happen, and that there's no point in trying to change, that there's no point in trying to get it under control, or to not do those things. There's to just let it happen. There's kind of a nihilistic or kind of a bleak outlook to that you cannot control or contain your basic nature, that you just have to accept it, whether it's good or bad. And maybe it's not nihilistic, maybe you could also think of it as fatalistic, that you're doomed to this, or you're destined to this, whether it's good or bad or evil, whether it's going to help people or hurt people, that you just have to accept who you are. And to me, that is probably one of the more horrifying aspects, and that's what's interesting, in that it's under the surface. On the surface level, you've got this horrific creature that can't be killed. I mean, that's true horror, right? The monster that can't be killed, that no matter what we try to do to it, we just can't get rid of it. But there's also the underlying thing that's really horrific about that, is that the creature that we can't get rid of also can't be changed, and that it has a very basic human quality to it also. And I think too, like that Also introduces a lot of other, or not a lot, but introduces some other themes in the manga of obsession, of jealousy, and the overall destructive nature of desire. So everyone who desires Tomie either gets killed or kills someone else or kills someone else and then is killed or is locked into this kind of eternal struggle with Tomie. And I say it's eternal struggle with Tomie because she's never going to go away. And it's this kind of like recurring cycle of obsession and violence and also physical regeneration and regeneration and renewal of violence that I find to be nihilistic, that you just can never quite overcome the futility of it, that it's just going to keep happening again and again, and that there's just no real explanation for it. There's no like origin story of Tomie. We don't know, was she cursed? Did she have like a potion that she drank? Is there a spirit that embodies her? We don't know. All we know is what she does to people, which is pretty horrific. There's a particular chapter in one of the later volumes titled Boy. And this one is really dark, and it's quite different from the other stories. And the title kind of gives it away already. It's called Boy. And in this chapter, we come across Tomie, and she's kind of like, she's trying to regenerate herself in this cave. And for some reason, her regeneration is taking a long time. And she's finding that she just can't regenerate alone. And this boy, who's out playing, comes across her. And she basically drains his energy slowly and replaces it with this destructive nature that she puts into other people. And she does this in order to regenerate herself. And I think one of the things that makes it so disturbing is that rather than just kill the boy and claim all of his energy or his spirit or whatever quickly in order to quickly regenerate herself, she kind of plays this game almost like a cat and mouse with the boy, where she takes a little bit from him and kind of teases him and then sends him out, knowing that as he goes back out and as he goes back home, he's going to be increasingly naughty and dangerous and destructive, and he's going to start to cause problems. And the boy does start to cause problems with his mother. And that's the whole thing. I don't want to give it away because I think, in my mind, this is kind of the climax of the story, although it's kind of an anticlimactic story. But what I want to say, though, is like, to me, this was the most disturbing chapter because of the way that she kind of just plays with the boy, rather than, whereas before in the other chapters there's a very clear pursuit of other people and of men, and a very clear cut, confrontation and conflict and fight with them. Whereas with the boy, it's this sort of cat and mouse, almost like the way that you would sometimes see a cat who's caught a mouse, and the mouse is still alive, and the cat is kind of batting it around, kind of just playing with it as it's, flailing around. It's really quite disturbing. So yeah, overall, Tomie, it's a really interesting manga. It's a very interesting horror manga. I think it's a great entry point into horror comics and horror manga. And of course, Junji Ito is just fantastic. If you haven't read anything by him before and you're curious, I think this is the place to start. Having said that, yeah, it's a bit disturbing. It's not incredibly graphic, although there are, there's definitely some horrifying imagery, but There's not a lot, there's no like graphic sex or anything like that. So it's relatively safe, a relatively safe read, in that respect. But again, it's more a story of psychological horror and of body horror, and it's just sort of around the futility, really just the futility of desire and obsession. All right, so the second title I want to talk about is Happiness by Shuzo Oshimi. And this was the first title I've read by Shuzo Oshimi, although he is quite famous now for some other books that he's written. But this one I thought was a little lesser known, and I thought I would try this one out first. Having said that, if you've got an Amazon Kindle or Comixology subscription, you can get all of these for free, which is pretty cool. So this manga is in 10 volumes, and it was published from 2015 to 2017, so it's certainly been out for a while, but it was a new one to me. And I think if you were to just kind of sum this up in one kind of simple idea, this is really about the darkest parts of human existence, which is pretty ironic considering the title, Happiness. All right, so you can probably tell from the cover that this is going to be a vampire story. And it starts out in contemporary Tokyo, and we've got a high school student named Makoto, and he's kind of got the typical, high school's not great, but it's not terrible for him either, and, he's got crushes, and he's not very popular. But his life is kind of mundane, and he's not happy with his life. And lo and behold, one day, or one night I should say, he's bitten by a vampire. Oops. So it's okay, it's manga. We need to have those sorts of suspension of belief. But I think it's important to point out really early that the title itself, it presents a kind of paradox, and that the characters are pursuing happiness, even as they grapple with a very horrifying life and a horrifying world. All they really want is to be happy, and they're trying to figure out which path should they take to find happiness. So you can tell right away that kind of really... Whereas I think like Tomie is maybe more bleak and nihilistic, this one is a bit more existentialist, but not necessarily in a bleak way, more in sort of a search for meaning kind of sense. And in that search, we have themes of identity, morality, and of course, because it's existentialism, consequences. And I think it's difficult you can't really talk about true happiness without considering consequences, right? And then when you factor in that characters are vampires, they have to think about consequences. And one of the main parts of the narrative, or the main threads in the narrative, is Makoto realizes he's a vampire. He has this overwhelming motorcycle outside. He has this overwhelming urge to drink blood. And there's a scene where he's trying to decide, should he kill his family to satisfy this overwhelming desire to drink blood, or should he suffer himself? Which is a pretty interesting take, I think, on the vampire story. Another thing that I think makes this manga really stand out is Oshimi's art style. He's really great at portraying emotion on the human face, and I think that's a very interesting thing to point out. Junji Ito does this also, although with Ito it's genuinely more depictions of horror, terror, shock, things like that. Whereas with Oshimi, there's more I shouldn't say there's more to it, but he's more interested in exploring conflict, internal conflict in the character. And I think the reason I want to point that out is that when I came to read manga, I had this idea in my mind of what manga characters looked like. And we see the sort of stereotypical, sort of cookie cutter manga characters. But these two artists don't do that. And I think that's very interesting. And for me, it's got me really hooked and really interested in reading more kinds of manga that go a bit deeper than we think that they normally do, or then deeper than we think that the genre goes or is capable of. So I think this is just with Tomie and Junji Ito, that's a very interesting entry point. I think this is also a very interesting entry point into manga as well. So again, if you're a fan of horror, if you're a fan of existentialist stories where characters are internally conflicted, where they're questioning their true nature, their true existence, where they're trying to find balance in life, trying to pursue happiness, if you will. Happiness is a great manga. And again, if you're interested in maybe weird horror stories, if you're interested in something that is definitely unique and strange and thought-provoking, Tomie by Junji Ito is another fantastic manga that you will enjoy. So once again, this has been Please Read Your Book. My name's Carl, and I hope to see you again soon.